understand the Ukrainian position and just have a general idea of what concessions they'd be willing to make? Because you're not going to get a ceasefire and an end of this war unless both sides make concessions.
Is Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on the verge of surrendering? With stalled US support, diplomatic maneuvers in Saudi Arabia, and growing pressure from multiple fronts, is this the moment where Ukraine bows out of the war? Or is this just another chapter in Zelensky's political resilience? Hello and welcome. You're watching Statecraft with me, Geeta Mohan. The latest headlines from Ukraine paint a picture of a leader under immense pressure. President Volodymyr Zelensky has been crisscrossing the globe securing international backing, but his most recent moves have raised eyebrows. A visit to Saudi Arabia, talks with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and most notably, the fact that he is not going to be part of the crucial meeting between US officials and Ukrainian officials in Jeddah. Instead, it is his chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, who's taken the reins. So what does this all mean? When Russia launched its invasion in 2022, Zelensky became the face of Ukrainian resistance. But in 2025, the reality looks far different. US military aid is on hold, Europe is pushing for peace talks, and Russia continues to press forward. Now, Zelensky is meeting with Saudi Arabia, one of the few players engaging both sides. US officials are also down in Jeddah, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who met with the Crown Prince himself. Zelensky left ahead of the crucial talks between US and Ukraine. Instead, his chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, led the delegation. A deliberate move or a sign of diminishing control? What's clear is that US military aid to Ukraine has been suspended following tense Oval Office meeting between Zelensky and US President Donald Trump. And Trump administration is now dealing directly with Moscow as well. So where does Ukraine stand in all of this? Zelensky has outlined a peace proposal, and it is a big one. It includes releasing Russian prisoners of war, halting long-range strikes on Russian targets, and declaring a truce at sea, provided Russia reciprocates. It's a gamble, but one that puts the burden of escalation on Moscow. If Putin rejects it, the world sees Russia as the aggressor. If he accepts, the war's momentum shifts dramatically. But here's the problem. Zelensky isn't operating from a position of strength anymore. The US shifting its strategy, European leaders pushing for phased peace, and Saudi Arabia's growing influence all suggest that Ukraine's window for an all-out military victory is closing fast. That brings us to a controversial question, that of surrender. If Zelensky makes peace, does he risk humiliation? History books are full of leaders who had to face the end of war on unfavorable terms. Think of Emperor Hirohito after Japan's surrender in World War II. He renounced his divine status, became a figurehead, and Japan rebuilt under American influence. Unlike them, Zelensky isn't leading a defeated nation yet, but the pressure he faces are enormous. President Trump has made no secret of his views. He wants an end to the war. He's willing to talk to Russia, and he's not interested in funding Ukraine indefinitely.
Big meetings coming up, as you know, in Saudi Arabia. That's going to include Russia. It'll be Ukraine. We'll see if we can get something done. I'd like to get something done. A lot of people died this week, as you know, in Ukraine. Not only Ukrainians, but Russians. So I think everybody wants to see it get done. We're going to make a lot of progress, I believe, this week. And let's see what happens with the whole Russia-Ukraine thing. I think you're going to have eventually, and maybe not in the distant future, you're going to have some pretty good results coming out of Saudi Arabia this week.
Are you going to?
Well, I think they will sign the minerals deal, but I want them to want peace. Right
How do
now,
they show that? How do they show they want peace?
Well, right now they haven't shown it to the extent that they should. I think right now they haven't, but I think they will be, and I think it's going to become evident over the next 2 or 3 days.
That means Zelensky's options are narrowing. Either he finds a way to negotiate a deal that secures Ukraine's sovereignty, or he risks being sidelined altogether. Domestically, Zelensky remains popular, but there seems to be cracks that are appearing. While his approval rating has climbed from 58% to 65% amid the fallout with Trump, there are still many who are voicing concerns with regards to his leadership. Now, that also suggests that many Ukrainians still see him as a fighter, but also are questioning his leadership. How long will that last if the war drags on? The economic toll is mounting, humanitarian crisis is worsening, and future elections could bring new challenges and challengers who argue that a different approach is needed. While Zelensky has not publicly indicated any willingness to back down, reports suggest the US is pushing for a partial ceasefire proposal, one that could freeze front lines but might also force Ukraine to make tough compromises and surrender. Even as peace talks began, Ukraine sent a powerful message overnight. In one of its largest drone offensives on Russian soil, Kyiv launched over 337 drones targeting Moscow and its surrounding regions. Russia's Ministry of Defense claims that 91 of these drones were intercepted over Moscow, yet the attacks damaged several buildings, including residential apartments in Ramenskoye. This bold military action signals that Ukraine is not willing to surrender easily, even as ceasefire negotiations loom. The Kremlin, on the other hand, is likely to use this strike as justification for further escalation. Russia has retaliated with devastating missile strikes on Ukrainian cities. In the last few weeks, air raids have intensified, killing dozens and leaving hundreds injured. The hardest hit cities include Kharkiv, Dnipro, and the capital, Kyiv, where key infrastructure was targeted. The sheer scale of destruction suggested that Moscow was increasing pressure on Ukraine, possibly to weaken its negotiating position ahead of the Saudi talks.
Переговоров пока нет. Пока американцы, по их же собственным словам, пытаются понять, насколько Украина готова к мирным переговорам. Пока переговоров нет, поэтому здесь пока нечего срывать, но то, что можно изрядно подпортить наметившуюся тенденцию, это меры и мероприятия подготовительного характера были проведены заранее, заблаговременно. И это как раз позволяет обеспечивать защиту Москвы, Московской области, а также многих других регионов.
Trump's stance on Ukraine has become a game changer. During his last meeting with Zelensky at the White House, he berated the Ukrainian leader for being ungrateful despite billions in US military aid. Since then, Washington has frozen assistance, suspended intelligence sharing, and cut Ukraine's access to satellite imagery.
We have to understand the Ukrainian position and just have a general idea of what concessions they'd be willing to make, because you're not going to get a ceasefire and an end to this war unless both sides make concessions. It's just obvious. We'll need to see, without, maybe we won't go into great details, we're not going to be sitting in a room drawing lines on a map, but just get a general sense of what concessions are in the realm of the possible for them and what they would need in return, and then find out what the Russian position is in that regard, and that'll give us a pretty good assessment of how far apart we truly are. Well, the Ukrainians are already receiving all defensive intelligence information as we speak. I think all the notion of the pause in aid broadly is something I hope we can resolve. Obviously, I think what happens tomorrow will be key to.
As negotiations took place in Saudi Arabia, Trump's influence does seem to loom large not just in that room but also in the world at large. Reports suggest the US president wanted or wants a ceasefire that includes Ukraine offering economic incentives such as mineral rights to the US in return for continued support. Will Zelensky accept this under duress, or will he refuse, risking losing a key ally? With rising casualties, continued airstrikes, and diplomatic pressure mounting, Ukraine faces a critical decision. While Kyiv has fiercely resisted territorial concessions so far, the loss of US military support could leave it vulnerable. If Ukraine agrees to a partial ceasefire, will that mark the beginning of the end of the conflict? Or will Russia use the pause to regroup and launch even deadlier offensives? The coming days will define Ukraine's fate. The battlefield remains active, but the negotiating table could ultimately decide the war's direction. Will Ukraine bow to pressure and agree not just to a ceasefire, but to a surrender? Or will it fight on despite dwindling support? We'll wait and see how the US plays a very key role in this entire war. But for now, the pressure is on Zelensky, not just to push for talks and seek ceasefire with Russia, but more importantly, Russia pushing Zelensky to the negotiating table for a surrender. Thank you for watching Statecraft.